Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Q&A about history of science and technology. Today I have to keep this a bit short. I've committed to give two completely different talks today, among several other things. So let's see. Thomas asks, is there much history of scientists, well known or not, starting companies? Oh yes, there definitely is. I have to say, back years ago, I used to think, when you hear about some scientist these days, you might think, oh yeah, that person must have been a professor in some university or some such other thing. Well, that might be true in a certain period of history, but there were times in the past when the typical scientist was kind of a wealthy landowner who happened to have a chance to do science as a hobby, or was a courtier, like that was another a common profession, or was kind of a consultant to the monarch type thing. Um, the idea of a scientist where it's like, where does a scientist hang out? Oh, that scientist, they must just be a professor. They must be, teaching at a university. There's a certain period in history when that's been sort of the typical place where you'd find scientists. I used to think years ago that it would be the case that when you hear of a scientist who is well known or whatever, you'd figure, that person must have had a company. Now, that hasn't been the case in most places. But if you look at computer science today, for example, many well-known computer science people have companies, even though they might also be professors. That's an option that didn't really exist back when I was kind of professoring and starting my company and so on. But so it is the case that many sort of scientists one has heard of have ended up, particularly both in the computer area and in the life sciences area, absolutely have had companies or have companies today. Um, it's a it's sort of I used to think it would be even more common and will be common in areas like physics. It hasn't been particularly common in that area. Why is that? Well, I think there are different kinds of companies and different things that happen. I mean, in something like computer science, the line between what is an academically kind of interesting thing to explore and what you can deliver in a product in many places is quite thin. And it's not surprising that people who sort of start companies and have companies are also people who are kind of known for their intellectual work. Same is true in areas of life science, where when you say somebody has a company in life sciences, the people who run the very biggest companies are mostly people who are professional runners of companies. But the companies that often do the innovative work in life sciences, those are often run by scientists. And usually what happens is the effort to actually sort of make a drug that can be put on the market is, $1 billion later. And at that point, the little company that made the innovation has been gobbled up into a bigger company, and the people running those bigger companies are not sort of science oriented. So it is there's a there's a there's kind of a uh, there's a mixture of these things. I think in terms of people, oh, I don't know, I'm thinking of many past examples. I mean, there are people, for some reason, I'm thinking of a chap called Doc Edgerton. At least he was always went by the name of Doc Edgerton at MIT, who was a guy who sort of really developed flash photography and very fast flash photography and so on, and did that as sort of a science thing. Meanwhile, built a company called EG&G, which was essentially a defense contractor, as sort of another thing. Or Amar Bose, who was a sort of professor of acoustics at MIT and did a bunch of things in acoustical engineering, but also built the company Bose that, does sort of practical things with sound. Or, I mean, there's a long list of these people. I think that the level of kind of science achievement. I don't know, for some reason, I'm also thinking of a chap, his first name, his last name is Roberts, and he's an immune system person who started New England Biolabs. I think maybe he got a Nobel Prize in biology, immunology, perhaps. And there are a decent number of other examples of people who have done, also in economics, there are examples of people who have started who've made intellectual progress in economics and started practical investment kinds of things. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily go together. I mean, I think John Maynard Keynes is said to have been a good investor, but then some people say he wasn't really a good investor, and I don't know how that really comes out. But yes, I think there's a collection. I would say that my own case, my interweaving of basic science with technology developments and companies has perhaps been more direct than it often is. I think it's although in both life sciences and computer science that can be fairly direct. But I think an interesting question might be in the more distant past, were there scientists starting companies? I'm certainly there were scientists involved with companies. I'll give you examples. Kelvin, known for his contributions to many areas of physics and so on. He was involved in a company. One of his big breaks was figuring out how to tell if the transatlantic cable, when it was being laid in the 1850s, maybe, whether it was going to break. And he was on the ship, figuring out when the first sort of successful transatlantic cable was laid that didn't break. Kelvin was the chap who had sort of made the instrument and was even operating the instrument that was saying, go faster, go slower, to the ship to make sure the cable didn't break. He subsequently started a company that was sort of a mixture of instrumentation and essentially consulting on cable laying. And he also, I think, had a part in the company that was the quasi-governmental company that was the one that laid the transatlantic cable. So that's an example. I think there was another example I was going to give of people who from the 1800s who had companies or who had involvement with commercial things. I mean, Kelvin is one example. I'm trying to think. Another one would be Babbage. Charles Babbage, he really wanted to make his difference engine and later his analytical engine a commercial thing. I mean, famously, there's this letter from Ada Lovelace to Charles Babbage where she's sort of saying, you're an incompetent manager. Let me, Ada, be the CEO of sort of what in modern times would be probably called Analytical Engine Inc. And you, Charles Babbage, be the CTO type thing. So he wanted to turn that into a company. It didn't really work. And then he actually was a partner in a life insurance company. That was sort of a new concept to do life insurance because, since everybody dies, it's a bad bet to bet on. You can't bet on not dying, so to speak, but it's a question of how the timing works. And now Babbage, interesting, comparing Kelvin and Babbage, both living in the mid-1800s and so on. I mean, Kelvin lived into the 1900s, but Babbage had inherited money from his father, who was a banker, and was kind of an independently wealthy doer of science and so on. Kelvin was a university guy who was a professor his whole life, and occasionally kind of got into administrative roles, but he was fundamentally a professor. And those were two sort of coexisting modes of doing science that existed in the 1800s. I would say that the, quotes, gentleman scientist, lady scientist, you don't hear so much about that, although there were examples of those. Actually, more examples of those. Ada Lovelace would be, perhaps could be classified as a lady scientist, so to speak. So could perhaps for unfortunate societal reasons, so could some of the other women who contributed to science in the 19th century, for example, because the institutions were very kind of, we only employ men at that time. And so sort of the only choice, if you were going to be a woman contributing to science, was to do it sort of privately, so to speak. But I think in terms of the kind of gentleman scientist, lady scientist, that has become less common in the 20th century, partly because the whole world of universities and so on has expanded so much. And kind of, if you're going to do intellectual stuff, well, you might as well be in a university. It's an interesting thing that as kind of the access to information has improved, it's no longer the case that you have to be in a university to be doing science, for example. It was the case at some point that the only way you'd know what was going on was to be sort of close to a university or maybe a court or something like this, a monarch's court or whatever. Those were places where sort of there was a flow of information coming through. Post-web, that's really all gone away. You can have the information from anywhere. You can, in principle, do science from anywhere. I think that fact has only been partially absorbed in the world. Also, in terms of the tools you need to do science, when you're doing certain kinds of experimental science, well, yes, gosh, you need, the particle accelerator or the big lab at the university with all sorts of equipment and so on. But increasingly, that won't be the case. I mean, there are starting to be cloud labs, like our friend's Emerald Cloud Lab for biology and chemistry experiments, where you're just typing Wolfram language code and the experiment is happening out there somewhere in some remote facility. And also insofar as sort of computational experiments become the big thing to do, you might be able to run them on your local computer, or you might run them in the cloud, but sort of anybody from anywhere can run them in the cloud. So I think the era when sort of to be a serious scientist, you had to be sort of at a center of scientific activity like a university, really is coming to an end. But I don't think that's been properly absorbed yet in the world. I think that will gradually absorb. And the thing that is still sort of to be worked through is, okay, so you can do science from anywhere, but how do you make a living doing science? And the primary ways to make a living doing science in the current world have been sort of to teach about science at a university, or maybe to work for the government doing science in something like a national lab or something of that kind. But I think that it's still sort of a missing piece is sort of, how do you be an independent scientist? In technology, there has been for quite a while the notion of an independent inventor. Sometimes their lives are not so happy, but they're kind of inventing things and writing up patents and going and trying to get people to use those patents and so on. But there hasn't really been an ecosystem like that in science, because yes, you can be an independent person, publishing papers in science, although sometimes the systems for sort of the gatekeepers of what counts as sort of the mainstream science can get in the way of that. But in principle, you can be doing that, but it's hard to make a living just publishing science papers if some entity, the government or some philanthropy or something, isn't somehow paying you for it for reasons that are not of sort of very direct, it's something which is of immediate sort of today utility in the world. So anyway, a few thoughts about that. Thomas is now asking, if Leibniz was around today, where do you think he would be working? What would he be doing if he was not in academia? Leibniz was basically worked for the Duke of Hanover and was sort of a consultant on all things intellectual for the Duke of Hanover. And he spent some time in Paris, sent out there to kind of find out what those French people were doing back in those days. This is the mid to later 1600s. But he also did things for the Duke of Hanover, like he was writing this giant history of that duchy, so to speak. I think partly for the purpose of, well, partly I think for the self-aggrandizement of that lineage, but also because of some issue about who could marry who according to the rules of the church type thing. And it was necessary to kind of go back and look at the history to kind of justify this or that thing. I think Leibniz was at some level in that regard kind of an early member of the justification economy, the kind of economy that exists to say, yes, it really is okay to do this. We'll write you an opinion or a 300-page report that explains why it's okay to do this. In that case, it was figuring out some piece of history about why somebody could marry somebody who they wanted to marry. Something that, but Leibniz, I don't know. I think in those days, kind of Leibniz was a general purpose consultant, and general purpose consultants are a little less common these days. I mean, there are large consulting firms. I don't think Leibniz would have been working for McKinsey if that had existed back then. Somehow it just doesn't seem like quite the picture. I think Leibniz actually would have loved to start a company. He wanted to make calculators. He had made this one calculator out of brass, and he spent 30 years trying to perfect it and make it work well. He actually had, I found in his archive, this lovely ad that he wrote for his calculator, where he explains that how wonderful it is and how it computes all these things. And I forget all the verbiage. And I was kind of thinking, well, maybe we should run it as a Mathematica ad of all the wonderful things it can compute. It's a bit offset, It was a brass device made in the 1680s, but kind of the notion of you can compute faster, better, more accurately, and so on was, I think, part of Leibniz's pitch. So I don't know whether he would have been a maker of brass calculators back in the day. I'm not sure that, I don't think he was a very good business person. He certainly had a lot of weird interactions with the people who were actually doing the manufacturing. Well, there was only one of them made, but they're trying to construct his device. I mean, there have been many scientists who've tried to have businesses, like Kepler, for example, had a business estimating the volumes of wine casks. So calculus wasn't known in Kepler's time, but you could look at the exterior of a wine cask and you look at its shape. And then the question was what's the volume of the liquid that's in there without having to pour the liquid out? And so Kepler was involved with that. I've always thought Archimedes was a good example. I mean, Archimedes was partly a consultant to the what was the name of the Archon, maybe of Syracuse. I forget what the name was. They had some honorific name, but the leader of Syracuse, king of Syracuse, whatever, in Sicily, not the Syracuse in upstate New York. That was a subsequent development. This is the one in Sicily, which existed in antiquity, and still exists today, actually. Except I think it's called Syracuse, but that may be just a British accent from the old world, as opposed to the Syracuse of American accenting. But in any case, the Archimedes did a lot of things to do with figuring out about projectiles to kind of shoot at your enemies, or different forms of mirrors that you could burn things with, and so on. And famously also, although I think there's a bit of an apocryphal tale, figuring out whether this crown that the king had was really made of gold or not, by figuring out its density, by seeing about its displacement of water, and so on. And but Archimedes was also very interesting calculation. I have always wondered whether Archimedes might have been the source for what became the Antikythera device, the one mechanical calculator device that we have found from antiquity. And I've always sort of had this vision that maybe Archimedes sort of had a business a bit like ours, making kind of mathematical calculational devices to be sold across the Greek and later Roman world, so to speak. But I think that's, as of right now, that is merely a matter of speculation. Perhaps it will be eventually found. I've been waiting for the moment where one can really excavate all of these old cities that have been built and built and built up. I think that time might be coming, because we're starting to have these devices that are kind of like worms that burrow in the ground, robotic worms that burrow in the ground for things like finding and placing cables and so on without having to dig everything up. And when that really becomes a well-developed technology, I think it will become possible to sort of do archaeology under cities like Athens and so on, where you're not going to be able to dig the whole city up to do it. But you can send in a robotic worm to go try and find all those interesting things that got buried millennia ago underneath there. And maybe you'll find, the production line for Antikythera devices somewhere with, the evidence that it was or was not Archimedes who was behind it. Let's see. Oh boy, so many questions here. Gosh, there's a question from Polio about interesting suggestions for history to research. Oh my gosh, there's so much of it. So much of how did things come to be believed, come to be thought. And I'm amazed at how difficult it is to do history. Like, for example, the fact that most physicists believed that space was discrete. Even though I've worked on discrete space for a long time, I didn't know that until a couple of years ago, because the physicists, Einstein, Bohr, Heisenberg, and so on, who looked at this, they didn't manage to make it work. And so they never wrote it down. People don't write papers that say, I tried this and it didn't work, or at least very few people write that. So it tends to be something that you have to deduce by looking at archives and so on. The history of discrete space would be an interesting thing to research and to really nail down where that came from and what happened to it. And, I know a few things about how people sort of gave up on it for different reasons, and mostly around the 1930s. But it will be interesting to know kind of how that died. And insofar as there were a few people who kept that flame alive, what was their lineage? It's the thing that is sort of interesting and surprising about history of science and technology is the extent to which sort of everything has a precursor. It's kind of like you can trace back these things. Sometimes it's within an individual person's life, but sometimes it sort of extends beyond, and it's the environment that they found themselves in. I mean, in my own case, my efforts in sort of applying the computational paradigm in science very much trace back to sort of the technological developments I've done and so on. And you can kind of see that line, at least if you go back, you can kind of see that line through things that I've done for many decades. It's not obvious because you kind of see the delivery of, I did this, I made this product, I wrote this book or something. It's very hard when you just look at the output. It's hard to see how that came to be. You kind of have to dig in and to kind of look at the threads to see how this came to be. And I think in almost anything that is a foundational result of a field, it had precursors. And what were those precursors? I've been exploring a bit in recent times the history of neural networks. And they have a big data point in 1943, Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts writing down kind of this logical representation of the nervous system. But there was a lot of past history going back into the 1800s that I certainly haven't fully unraveled yet. There are things that are sort of big pieces of history like that. That's a fairly big one. There are much smaller, more specific pieces of history. But sort of the question is always, how did people come to believe that? How did that happen? If you take any kind of advance that's been made, it'll have some precursor. What was it? In the end, it's understandable. At least that's been my experience. But sometimes it takes a lot of effort to sort of find something where you can really explain all the steps. Let's see. Katie asks, what's the history of walking meetings? Were there notable practitioners before me? Oh boy, somebody who knows too much about my life type thing. Yeah, I for the last, 20 years or so, have tried to sort of, as a way of keeping myself in better condition, I usually walk for hour and a half, 2 hours every day. And typically my first couple of meetings of the day I do while I'm walking around and looking at a phone. Usually these days used to be much more a computer, and I had this whole sort of popcorn selling apparatus for being able to work on a computer. But I have to say resolutions of phones and so on have increased, and the density of meetings where I'm really just looking at what somebody else is doing rather than having to type myself has gone up. But in any case, sometimes I get to do meetings in person with people walking, and that's great. I have to say, back in the 1990s, early 1990s, I had kind of imagined that it would be a really cool thing to be able to work while I walked. And I had kind of had this idea that, I'd do that by having some virtual reality system. Virtual reality was kind of a new thing at the beginning of the 1990s. And then that I would have some chord keyboard where, a keyboard a bit like a stenographer's keyboard where you're just, you have your fingers persistently on all the keys, but you're just pressing different combinations of keys to get different letters. So I kind of imagined myself kind of walking around the neighborhood, so to speak, with a virtual reality thing or more like augmented reality, so I could see where I was going, and a chord keyboard. Well, it didn't happen in the 1990s. Then in the early 2000s, I realized, gosh, golly, it's actually really easy. You can set up a computer on a treadmill, and I had sort of imagined you wouldn't be able to type on a static keyboard as you're walking, but actually up to at least about 2.8 miles an hour for me, it's really pretty easy to sort of the biomechanics problem of sort of pivoting your wrist so that you can keep typing at that speed. And although it's not my favorite thing to walk on a treadmill, I prefer to walk free range outside and so on. There's a thing where you can type at the same time and no virtual reality required. I have to say that in recent times when the Apple Vision Pro came out, I'm like, finally, I can actually do the thing that I'd planned to do at the beginning of the 1990s, walk outside with VR and, work at the same time. I tried it, and in, I don't know, 15 seconds or something, I got violently motion sick. So at least the frame rates of the Vision Pro or the way that the Vision Pro deals with sort of head motion and so on, and at least for whatever my vestibular system and so on is set up, doesn't yet work for me to do that. And actually, I'm not sure if that's ever going to be a thing, so to speak. But that's the solo, working while you're walking type thing. In terms of the walking around and chatting with people, I certainly know, I've done that an awful lot. I find it a pleasant way to interact, but it's certainly a thing where I have heard about it in the past. I mean, there was a school of philosophy usually called the Peripatetic school, where they were kind of walking around as they're doing their thinking back in antiquity. Somehow I'm reminded my friend Dick Feynman, physicist, telling me stories about walks that he'd gone on. Two that come to mind particularly. One was with Niels Bohr, and Dick Feynman told me he went on this long walk with Niels Bohr, but Niels Bohr had this sufficiently accented English, from Danish, I guess, that Feynman could understand almost nothing of what he said on the whole walk. Meanwhile, did he tell me he'd gone on? I'm trying to remember. I think I was reminded of his comments about Paul Dirac, where he had sort of the opposite problem. Niels Bohr would just keep talking, but he couldn't understand a word he said. And Dirac would say almost nothing, would monosyllabic. After a long, long, long discussion, you would get a yes or a no out of Dirac. In any case, so I don't know the full tradition of kind of walk while you work. I think perhaps in the world of philosophy, perhaps it is a bit more common. It is certainly inconvenient if you're like, hey, let me show you this thing, and you're kind of walking along. That doesn't really work quite so well. So it's more a conceptual discussion, so to speak, than it is a let me show you something. Well, as a solo walker, you can look at a phone or whatever, and certainly when it comes to things other than kind of sort of intellectual, scientific kinds of things, that's a different story. Let's see. Brady is asking, was the first GUI and mouse and keyboard predictable beforehand, or was it a surprise at the time? It's an interesting question. I mean, I certainly talked to Doug Engelbart, who was the inventor of the mouse, and I saw the Xerox Alto back in 1979 when it wasn't very many years old. That was the first sort of GUI. You know, when I saw the first GUI, I didn't think it could possibly work. I just was seeing these things where you had sort of windows that were on top of each other, and it was like, well, you drag from one window to another, but what happens when one is on top of the other? I thought, this can't possibly work, but it did. So it's often so hard to know for things that involve sort of the ergonomics, the human interaction with things. It's so hard to know, is it going to feel right and actually work? Or is it going to be incredibly awkward and like, oh, you know, I mean, I think of that every time I'm in this situation where I have windows on my screen, I'm trying to drag from here to there, and I can't quite separate the windows enough to be able to get them to the point where I can drag from one to the other. It's like, look, I saw that on the very, very first time I saw a GUI back in 1979. I saw that was you know, that you will be stuck with that. And you know, it turned out that wasn't a very important case. So you can still have a GUI and have it work. You know, I think that the concept, you know, before the mouse, there were certainly things. So most computer interaction was with first of all teletypes, you know, where you actually typed and you got a reel of paper coming out, or a paper tape, for example, that you could read into some other computer. And then later, what, at least in British English, were called VDUs, visual display units. I'm not sure whether that was ever an American term. But in any case, they were displays where you would have where they were cathode ray tubes, and they had a kind of mask inside where, depending where the electron beam went, it would go through the piece of the mask that had the shape of an A, the shape of a B, the shape of a C, and you were putting these characters out in, you know, 80 characters per line, 24 lines to a page. You were putting them out on the screen in that way. And then the kind of, how do you move around on that screen? Well, you use arrow keys perhaps to move on that screen. There were, on another sort of tradition of displays, were things that started from storage oscilloscopes that had long lifetime phosphors, where, you know, once that spot has been painted in a particular place, it would be, you could still see the spot for a while afterwards. That turned into later ones that would print from the oscilloscope screen. But those early storage scopes, which turned into some early graphical displays, you typically would have this wheel that you could move around that would move a cursor around. It wasn't a mouse where you were moving the thing, you were moving a wheel. Now, where did that control come from? My guess is that control came from things like planes, airplanes. There isn't a control like that as such. I mean, it's sort of the inverse of that exists in a plane. You know, you have a yoke where you're pulling it, pushing it, twisting it, whatever. But the artificial horizon is a sphere that is moving around to indicate where you are relative to relative to the Earth, so to speak. And somehow that idea of a ball to control orientation, I kind of think that might have been from that kind of source. I am reminded there was a movie that we were once almost pulled into providing some science input for, that was a movie that involved time travel and that had these kind of time traveling craft. And I have to say, I thought it was just a wonderful kind of visual pun or something. Instead of having that sphere that represents kind of your orientation in space for an airplane, I was suggesting that you have a light cone that represents your orientation in space-time as a time-traveling craft, so to speak. but the movie went in a different direction and was not, in the end, didn't sort of get serious about the science representation of things. And I'm going to have to leave very soon, but I want to try and address this, at least this question about GUIs and mice and well, keyboards. Yeah, the keyboard, that's an interesting one. Typewriters, I guess, when type was first developed, it was in, even when I was a kid, the sort of, I guess, what in American is called letterpress type, where you have, just a bunch of pieces of lead that are the font, so to speak, where the font is sort of this wooden thing where you have all these pieces of lead that represent the different letters, and you would pick one out and you would arrange it in this tray and put lead in between the lines to produce leading to make spaces, and you would tie the thing up with a piece of string and so on. Then you would start printing from it and all that. And you were literally pulling pieces of type out of these wooden boxes to set them up to be able to print from them. And at some point, I don't actually know this history, it was realized that yes, you could do something with a ribbon, with a typewriter, and then sort of what was the interface that you could provide to that. I wonder how obvious that was. I don't think there was much. I don't remember seeing many precursors. I mean, I think it was like, yeah, this is probably from the piano, so to speak. It was probably kind of keying off that kind of idea that you have a key that you press to key off the idea with a key, so to speak, that you press, and then, the hammer hits the string in the piano. My guess is that was sort of the inspiration for what happens with a typewriter, and that it was kind of obvious that you would have a keyboard. Now, the fact that it's a keyboard that has many levels, kind of like an organ keyboard, that's the right form factor for a keyboard. I think I'm not sure when that came in. And the concept that you would have the QWERTY arrangement, that was originally arranged in such a way that you typically wouldn't get the things from the two hands to, you press one key with one hand, and you press the other another key with another hand, and you could get it so that the two sort of kind of hammers, the two levers, would kind of get all tangled up because you press them at the same time. And I think that keyboard was partly set up to not have that happen. Some people say that it was sort of set up to slow people down so that you wouldn't get kind of tangles happening. I'm not sure that's really true. But in any case, I think, the keyboard was 100 years at least before things like the mouse. And the concept of GUIs, of a graphical interface, that's kind of really that relied on the idea of a bitmap display, because in these character displays where you just have the CRT and you're putting individual characters on the screen, there isn't really this notion of, oh, I can have something like a window that represents these things. It's not a graphical display. What happened in early computers, like, the Apple II, the early personal computers, they would have a small display, and you could indeed address every pixel in the display, but the notion that there just wasn't enough resolution in the display that you could really represent things like windows and so on. And I think that came in originally, I think it was developed at Xerox PARC, Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. Xerox was a long time, copier company and office automation company. And the idea really was to imitate pieces of paper. And that's where the kind of black on white screen came from and all that kind of thing. I find it really ironic that everybody sees the future now as being dark mode. And maybe I'll eventually switch to dark mode again, having been in dark mode for the first, what was it? Probably at least, what was it? It was the first decade of my computer life from 1973 to 1983. I was kind of living in dark mode, so to speak, with character displays where the character is bright on a dark background. Then in 1983, bitmap displays, high-resolution bitmap displays became common, first with companies like Sun Microsystems and Apollo and so on, where it became realistic to have bitmapped, which means there's lots of memory in the computer, and there's a representation of where the pixels are lit up on the screen in the memory of the computer, and you're kind of poking at the memory of the computer to get things on the screen. And I think I'm going to have to go here. So thanks. I see a lot of other interesting questions, but they will have to wait for another time. So thanks for joining me now, and I have to go off to another thing. So bye for now.